When I was about 14 years old, I was introduced to a man who claimed he was going to cure Alzheimer's. His drive came from fear, as his wife's mother had lost her life to the disease, and he was afraid that he was going to lose his wife the same way, and his kids were going to have to go through the same thing she did. He had the education, natural ability, and talent to cure the disease. But yet, here we are today, and the disease is still a mystery. Let me backtrack a second. I need to clarify one thing. When I say introduced to a man, I mean on my TV screen. I was sitting in the comfort of my bed, beginning to watch the show Grey's Anatomy. Derek Shepherd in the show is a world-renowned neurosurgeon. He is the reason why I became interested in the brain. Although I did not go onto the path of neurosurgery, I have still decided to study the brain in neuropsychology. Let me start by explaining what neuropsychology is. Neuropsychology is the connection between the biology of your brain and your behaviors. Everything you do has to do with the chemical reaction in your brain. My research this year has been to narrow down my interest in the field. As for a subspecialty, it is extremely broad. I have studied concussions, pediatrics, autism, traumatic brain injuries, and Alzheimer's. With every topic I have looked into, many of the studies have inconclusive evidence. The human body is too complex for studies to have a way to be for. The human body is too complex for a study to encompass every and all person, especially in the brain, since there is such a high level of variation between each person. My Alzheimer's research was focused upon how the disease is contracted. Alzheimer's is associated with such a high mortality rate because it does so much damage for the brain, because there's no way to diagnose it unless a person has a symptom. The article that I looked into showed how it's so strong that it could potentially be contracted not only through genetics but also through blood or bodily fluids. After reading this article, I was extremely confused and didn't really get anywhere because of the inconclusive evidence, so I had to step back and not get discouraged. So with interviews coming up, and I had found a traumatic brain neuropsychologist to talk to, I decided to look more into trauma because I didn't think that was a path that I was going to go on. So I started looking at how relocation, like with refugees, affects your brain. And what I found especially interesting with that was that the actual relocation isn't what affects a person, it's the transition. So it's really the culture shock that affects someone's brain and causes PTSD or any other psychological disorder. After meeting with the traumatic neuropsychologist, we talked a lot about concussions during that interview, so I decided to focus a lot of my research on concussions, especially since he told me that with a concussion, it's not something that typically shows up on any sort of scan, and with technology improving, there are some ways that you can see it. It's just not very common, and concussions are a common injury, so it's frustrating to them that there's not necessarily an easy way to diagnose that. So I started looking at what's called the impact test, and it's what you do following a concussion. So it basically just tests your behavior. And so you normally have to have a baseline test and baseline instruction to show how to have success with this test, because it's a connection and how you, after being hit in the head or having some sort of impact on your brain, how that has affected you and which parts of your brain, whether that's your speech or your memory, are impacted by that. So that was especially frustrating because with that research, I found that the only way you can really look into a concussion is with how it affects you and not right away. Because if you have a head injury, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a concussion. It depends on how hard you were hit. After looking at that, I looked at more tests and saw that there really is no connection between them, and that there's no solid way or post-concussion test that shows you how a concussion really impacts you. So I started brainstorming ideas, and with this interest, I thought that I was going to focus my original work on concussions. With the inconclusive research, I found that my informational interviews were really the best source of information. So my first interview, which I mentioned earlier, was with Dr. Sid Dixon. He works at the Baylor Institute of Rehab. He deals with traumatic brain injuries, especially concussions. He actually spends many of his, or used to spend many of his weekend nights on the football fields at high school football games, just to evaluate anyone that has a unusually hard hit to the head, just to make sure that high school athletes are getting the treatment they need as well, because they don't have the money in high schools to have the equipment and the tests administered to everyone. They have to do that on their own time. So to have him on the sidelines was really great. And he also spends one day a week studying Alzheimer's, which I just felt was a great connection, considering that was what I was focusing on. And it was really strange and interesting to me that someone that I had no idea had a connection with, that was the first person I interviewed. So then my second interview was a very different path. This was with Dr. Michael McLean. He works in private practice and is a pediatric neuropsychologist. So what I found talking to him was that private practice isn't really something that I'm interested in. I'm not an economic or business type person. I really want to just focus on the research of neuropsychology. So I definitely would see myself working in a hospital or a clinic rather than having a private practice, because you have to do a lot of the, not only the write-ups for when you have a different patient that you see, but also you have to do the billing and stuff like that. So what I found with the pediatrics is that you really have to not only evaluate your patient, you have to evaluate everyone around them, like their teachers and their parents, because they can't tell you that much information. Their parents and teachers can tell you that something's wrong, but the kids don't necessarily understand that. And what's crazy is that the parents can be the best part of the experience or the worst, because they could be the cause of whatever is wrong with their children, whether it's their child has a severe anxiety disorder, that could be because of the amount of pressure, or an abusive home. And so that just makes the process with pediatrics especially difficult. I interviewed another pediatric neuropsychologist. Her name is Dr. Lindy Pottinger. She is the director of child neuropsychology. She's the director of child neuropsychology and counseling center. She only received her PhD when she was 50 years old. She graduated from college at the same time that one of her sons graduated from high school. So even though she took a step back and focused on her family, she still found a way to wind up doing what she loves. And our interview was really great. I could see how passionate she was about her job and how excited she was to be handling not only her patients, but everyone that's working under her as well, and to mentor them and to take them under her wing. And she had never worked a day in her life until she was the director of child neuropsychology. So she went from being a stay-at-home mom to a director of a counseling center. So with my fourth interview, I went back to traumatic neuropsychology. This is Dr. Keir Bison. She works at Baylor Rehab as well. I met her in an interesting way, actually. I was taking pictures at our football game at the Star, and I knew from Dr. Dixon that there would be someone from Baylor at almost any game. So I went up to her and introduced myself and explained what I was doing and that I had talked to Dr. Dixon. And she actually isn't necessarily on the project of the concussions, but she's known Dr. Dixon for 10 years, so she's been helping him out with that project. She's not only a clinical neuropsychologist, but she's also board certified in rehabilitation psychology, which means that she has repeat patients and she deals with their rehab. She doesn't just diagnose them. With everyone else that I talked to, they mainly focused on the diagnosis process, and then they wrote up the 20-page report and basically sent them back to either a counselor or back to their neurologist, which is how many of them get recommended. So one of the things she said to me was, it just really stuck with me. She said, it's really great when someone who comes in a wheelchair can walk out of my office, or someone who came in with little to no chance to live and can completely recover. And I just think that dealing with patients on the long term is extremely satisfying, because you can see results like that and not only have the beginning and the report and give that to someone else when really you've taken the first step into maybe changing their life. I'd want to follow through with that. So after talking to her as well, I kind of picked her brain about original work ideas and what she thought about concussions, and I also talked to her about all the inconclusive evidence that I had found with a lot of my research, and she kind of was like, that's kind of the biggest problem I've had with a lot of research, because everyone's so different, and it's the way we act, our personalities, that's our brain, and not everyone has the same personality, so not everyone has the same brain chemistry. So I kind of took a step back from concussions because I was kind of discouraged on the idea of creating some sort of concussion test for my original work after talking with her, even though that is what I'd been focusing on for a couple of weeks. So I decided to backtrack and go on back to the path of what got me interested in this field in the first place, and I decided to look back on Alzheimer's. And I was looking at ways to diagnose it without having to wait for symptoms to show, because it's a degenerative brain disease, which means that parts of your brain are basically going away. There are gaps between the lobes that aren't supposed to be there, and that's why you lose your memory and you lose some of your cognitive abilities. And so I looked back on that, and I was trying to figure out if there was some sort of chemical test or blood test that could help with the diagnosis process, because when you start showing symptoms, your brain is normally too far gone. And I wanted to try to reduce the very high mortality rate. So with the research I was finding was that the proteins and the metabolic reactions that are occurring in your brain are really what researchers are looking at now and trying to create what they call a biomarker. So they would test your spinal fluid at some point in your life, and then if you start having any issues or you have like the Alzheimer's gene in your family, they'll test it again to see if those proteins which are breaking down your brain, which come with the disease, are present. So, but I realized that these are people that have their PhD in neuropsychology, and they haven't been able to make this successful yet, and they have a lot more solid background knowledge than I do. So for my original work, I decided that I was going to do some really in-depth research on the parts of the brain and how each part of the brain is impacted, or how each part of the brain impacts your behavior. So I wanted to create two models, one that is a normal brain and one that I can see from an autopsy report, and create that as a model and show the gaps in the brain and where those gaps occur and the different reactions that are occurring or aren't occurring are affecting the brain and causing this to happen, so then I can have a better understanding of the proteins that are needed for the biomarker to create that as my final product. These interviews were not only a great source of information about the field, but allowed me to build connections with successful people who share the same passion as I do for neuropsychology. The abundance of new information I have gathered leaves me wanting more. I am finding my way to become the Derek Shepard of neuropsychology. And I will leave you with my quote for this year, as it has really inspired me to keep moving forward, even though the research is so inconclusive and has been a real struggle. Don't aim for success. If you are doing what you love, success will come naturally. Thank you.